Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 16th of November. Today's update will focus on Velyka Novosilka, Kurakhove, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, then further north, Kupiansk, and we'll finish off with Kursk. I want to mention today some important changes that are going to occur within the brigade level staff in a certain part of the front line on the Russian side. We're also going to look at the Ukrainians finally integrating one of their newly formed mechanized units to the fighting after completing their training in France. I want to begin first by zooming in and looking at an advance that was recorded by the Ukrainian side. Just west of Rivnopil, the Russian forces are expanding control. They got control over fields amounting to nearly 4 square kilometers. In the process, they really have created this salient, which includes Novodarivka, which is largely in a gray zone, and also the fields to the east of it. And so you can see very clearly how these two Russian vectors that really popped up, they are now going to form the basis for a new solid front line, which will, of course, lead further northwards towards Novopil and Zelenopole, but more generally will help the Russian forces get control over a broader ridge of territory located west of Velyka Novosilka. As we discussed in great detail in yesterday's video, this really massive ridge in an area that, in relative terms, if you're comparing it to the areas to the west, is really not that well fortified. I'm sure that there are a lot of individual defense nodes within tree lines that have to be overrun, and that's a big part of why the Russians are not just advancing directly through these fields over here. They're trying to go from a more western direction to bypass them, and in the process, of course, of the fight in villages. In any case, though, the huge amount of topographic gains that it gives the Russian forces cannot be understated. The fact that they would have this really great vantage point and that they already have a massive chunk of it already under their control, and you can see that marked over here, it is a huge advantage that helps them overlook the entirety of the Velyka Novosilka sector, the city, the roads leading into it, of roads that are connecting from Andriivka, actually, you can see it over here, to Velyka Novosilka, that are really not that well defended from the eastern axis, from the eastern flank. And the only village really left there as a protection is Rozdolnie. You do have anti-tank ditches that were dug with the sort of hope being that they would prevent attacks coming in from the south to the north, and that's not completely mapped on the map over here. There actually are more anti-tank ditches, but based on the Russian capture of Maksimivka, which was now admitted by Ukrainian sources, and also the other villages nearby like Shakhtarsk, you do have this eastern flank which is really evident and cannot be repelled using top-down anti-tank ditches. So that's a longer term issue that won't just affect Velyka Novosilka and the road connecting it to Andriivka, but more generally the logistics here, because you have a triangle and the left-hand portion of it is Komar. Komar is a very important logistics hub. It also runs along the Mokriali River, and it actually is defended in a vertical manner with a lot of layers of defense that were built up by the Ukrainians and should be expanded at this point, although it's reaching the point where the Ukrainians are going to be too close to the line of contact to move in any sort of massive engineering equipment. And the issue is, if the Russians were to get control over this road network, they would have a perfect eastern flank to bypass the vertical defenses that we see built primarily along the Mokriali River or just to the west of it. We've now received that many updates today from Kurakhove, or the fierce clashes going on to the south. That is likely because there are attempts by the Ukrainians to stabilize the situation. They are trying to maintain control in the urban cluster, so that would be mainly the responsibility of the 46th Brigade, whereas the 33rd Mechanized Brigade is moving in additional resources to this particular salient pocket, trying to move in especially their armored elements from the tank battalion, moving in a lot of Leopard 2A4s and infantry fighting vehicles to counter Russian columns. So the fighting, at least as of right now, night of November 16th, is concentrated around Dalnie and the routes leading up to it, including the gullies, and then also the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove around school number 3. Not much of an update from there, but we do have a confirmation of Russian control in Vozisenka. This is based on a compilation from the Northern Eagle Battalion. It's a part of the 151st Mechanized Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes onto Russian private vehicles in this Russian assault that allowed them to capture this particular village, which could have come from the north, could have come from the east, I don't know. They actually used a lot of pickup trucks or just private vehicles, not necessarily armored vehicles or even light vehicles. They just drove in with them, and those same pieces of equipment, those units of vehicles, were targeted by the Ukrainian side, along with infantry that were walking along open fields, making it their way there, or were along the windbreaks of the tree line, which of course we know the Russians, they really do try to make the most out of. And now, given the capture of the village, they're going to have access to this windbreak series, making its way all the way southwards to Beretsky, which already is in a very untenable situation. As we know, the Russians are operating within Novosilka, and really the amount of troops left within the salient is diminishing by the day. Where there is the most Ukrainian resistance, though, would be Sontsivka. This is an area where they definitely are not willing to cede territory. It is crucial for them to drag out the fighting here and ensure that the status quo remains in and around this village, not anywhere past it. Really, with the intention of not even just protecting Kurakhove, because that's really soon going to be acknowledged as an area that cannot be defended in its full extent. Looking at Andriivka, you need to ensure that its eastern flank is well protected and has enough time to build up. And that would not be guaranteed if Sontsivka were to fall, as we know. But I do find it interesting that the 151st Brigade is now operating here, because for what appears to be, I don't know, 4 or 5 months, they've been very active around Hrodivka and generally the sector east of Pokrovsk. And they were one of the units moved in as an emergency measure following the Russian breakthrough east of, or west, I should say, of the Vovcha River. And yes, they were successful in holding out and preventing deeper Russian exploitations. They successfully are manning the defense line on the perimeter, the third to last defense line, before reaching Pokrovsk, and really have really contributed to stalemates continuing in the city of Hrodivka. So now at least certain elements of said brigade are being moved southwards to deal with an area that is far more active, and that would be the Sontsivka region and even territories to the east of it, trying to pick off Russian soldiers. So just keep an eye out for that troop movement. In addition, the Russian forces have also advanced in the Hryhorivka area. So yesterday we reported on the capture of Yurivka by Russian forces. We now have this footage. This is from November 16th. It's from the 15th Motor Rifle Brigade, one of the main Russian units now engaged in the fighting. And attached to them is the 1437th Territorial Motorized Rifle Regiment. And according to the 15th Brigade, they're calling it an assault regiment. So I don't know if it's and or, whether it's assault or territorial motorized rifle. Doesn't really matter. The element is newly created and is a part of the broader umbrella of the 15th Brigade, which I would say in terms of size is relatively large in comparison to other Russian brigades, and they are now operating in Saidove. They didn't have a crucial front line role in the successive captures in Saidove. They did play some role, and we saw some of their units with the flag raising, but they weren't the primary unit involved. But now it appears that due to the rotations and movement, they're playing an even bigger share in the responsibility. So they captured at the very least 1.4 square kilometers, took over Hryhorivka in its entirety, raised up the flag over there. They took 5 Ukrainian soldiers POW, and now the only question left is what's going on with Petrivka to the northwest. There appears to be some sort of gray zone here, but potentially by now the Russians have also cleared up that region, meaning you have this stretch of land that I talked about in earlier videos that amounts to 4 kilometers between the line of contact and the Chenske, which would be the southern perimeter of Pokrovsk. Really important that the Ukrainians have some sort of buffer zone between those two territories to ensure that Pokrovsk is not dealing with load from an additional vector, because definitely the Ukrainian reinforcements and defense garrison was able to contain the eastern Pokrovsk attacks, but also to a certain extent that has to do with the Russians exploiting advances elsewhere. We've talked about this previously. Then having to deal with southern attacks coming in from areas that are more exposed, because you have just so many routes that the Russians can utilize over here on highways or on rail lines that have not been built up and defenses beefed up because there wasn't an anticipation of an imminent assault. And also more generally, trenches not being built in fields or elements, units not being stationed over there. All of it is a combination that is not conducive for Ukrainian defensive purposes at this moment. And that's why the Russians continue to advance over here, continuing to exploit the excesses of the Ukrainian withdrawals west of Selidove. So now the objective is going to be, of course, Postinka, which is one of the final villages just west of Selidove. You have a few smaller ones like Zovteve and Pushkine. And then you have this large chunk of open fields, which is perfect for Russian armored assets to both approach the Dnipro border, also to reach the highway that connects Andriivka to Pokrovsk, and then turn attention northwards towards areas that are even more exposed on the city's rear. But again, that is all really predicated upon first the Russians clearing up the final Ukrainian vestiges of defense in populated areas west of Selidove, which is currently being defended by Marine units. 35th Brigade is here, 25th Air Assault Brigade is here, so that's going to be their task. Now, to look at Toretsk, first of all, you can see Russian advances in Nelipivka have continued 0.8 square kilometer advance across a broader front, as we talked about in yesterday's video. In addition, here you can see a video from the 49th Assault Battalion, Carpathian Sich. That's a unit that previously operated around the Zherebets River, the Terni region. You're pretty familiar with it by now. And it appears at some point over the past few months, it was moved to this area to just beef up defense around the Zabalka area. And it may also be playing a role in the operations within that micro district, because previously the Ukrainians, over the past month, they were able to repel Russian assaults here and eventually counterattack and take it in its entirety. Today, you're going to see that the Russians reversed that course, but that may have been some of the roles that the brigade or battalion, did complete in this area. So they are also operating a bit to the south and trying to provide some defensive depth in those areas. So they conducted grenade drop operations onto forested areas on November 16th, indicating a Russian advance west of the local substation. And this is important because it provides an eastern flank to finally push the Ukrainians out of the northern section of Nelipivka, because the Ukrainians have proven that they can concentrate the Russian advances along very narrow corridors. And in those cases, it's easier for them to repel them by isolating Russian columns one by one and taking them out. And they don't have to worry as much about the flanks. But now, if the Russians are going to push from the east with soldiers, undermine the trenches here, and then begin infiltrating houses, there's not much the Ukrainians can do with their current defensive structure in this area, which really is far away from the broader network, which would include areas like Novospassky, Shecherbinivka, Leonidivka. Those areas, they are far more connected and in sync with the broader Ukrainian Donbass area, the logistics, the cities that are connected like Konstantinivka, Toretsk itself. Nelipivka is a bit deep and really is experiencing intense pressure right now. When you look at Toretsk, you can see that the Russian forces have interestingly been able to infiltrate really, really deep westwards. Let's actually look at the extent. It's about 1.6 kilometers westwards. And you can see, based on a geolocation from the Predator Police Brigade, one of the main Ukrainian defensive elements in this entire front, they had FPV strikes targeting 2 Russian soldiers in the Zabalka district. I really can't say for sure if that indicates that the entirety of the district is under Russian control, because we don't know what's going on with this enclave to the south, with the stadium, and with the duplexes to the north. But the course in between the forested region and western Zabalka definitely had to have come under some form of Russian control in order for whether it be motorized rifle elements or DRGs to make their way all across here and reach the actual western edge. That's something that cannot happen under normal circumstances. And it will be indicative of Russian forces being able to overwhelm the Ukrainians lacking manpower over here, or DRGs being able to very efficiently make their way through a very battle-hardened area and then make their presence known. So before we make definitive conclusions as to what this means for the entirety of the Ukrainian presence here, I would wait for additional proof, but definitely it is a huge development if it continues to unfold in this direction, because this was one of the silver linings for the Ukrainians, that they were able to conduct localized counterattacks over here, prevent the Russians from reaching the landfills that overlook the entirety of Toretsk. If they cannot maintain this, then it will have really significant implications for the landfills, for all the areas leading into Toretsk, the western edge of the city, and then also the areas along the rail line that we just talked about. They would be under threat, both in terms of elevation and in terms of direct attacks. They would no longer have any defense mechanism if the Russians were to reach the landfills over here. By that point, the Russians would already bypass the trenches built that were meant to separate the villages from Toretsk itself. So definitely something to keep an eye out for, as well as the Russian penetration deeper into Toretsk that we talked about in yesterday's video. Now, in relation to Chasiv Yar, you can see here a significant Russian advance. They're continuing to chip away at Ukrainian holdings east of the canal, and a lot of sources, even Ukrainian ones, are talking about a full Ukrainian withdrawal west of the Donbass Canal. That is certainly a possibility. I'm just waiting out for this final sort of indication of Russian troops being present in this shaded area. But we know for sure, based on Ukrainian reporting and geolocations, of an advance amounting to nearly 4 square kilometers along the rail line north of Kurdyumivka, also west of Andriivka and south of Klishivka. So really, this has allowed the Russians to take control over a lot of vestiges of the Ukrainian defense, a lot of local dugouts, stretches of various forested regions, now all of them coming under Russian control with relatively minimal Ukrainian resistance on the field. In the air, there are drone crews that are targeting Russian soldiers during their advances, and this indicates to us that, first of all, the 93rd Brigade is still here in some limited capacity, but then also that the Russian troops, they are moving through one by one and clearing out defensive locations without any direct resistance from the Ukrainians on the ground, because they had already withdrawn from those forward areas. So 93rd Brigade, I said that previously, they had withdrawn their forces, a significant portion of them, from this area, from the Chasiv Yar slash, I suppose, Klishivka region, and that's true. A very, very large portion, many battalions of the brigade were moved away, but at the very least, one drone unit and perhaps maybe one motor mechanized battalion may be still operating in this region over here to provide some sort of additional support to the rest of the Ukrainian defense garrison. So they released a video of grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers trying to pick them off. And now the Russians have the potential to get really large pieces of territory under their control with relatively minimal casualties, and then begin to plan next how and where will they cross over the canal, and then which locations will be targeted. Will it be in relation to the northern defense network, I suppose north of Toretsk, because this area really is dense in defenses. It's an area that has not been tested much by the Russian forces, and whenever it has been, the Ukrainians were able to repel the attacks, and usually the Russians were very speculative about it, and that will be a part of a broader preparation for attacking Konstantinivka. So that's one thing to look at. Also, it could provide additional support and strengthening for the already present, bridgehead across west of the canal that is currently fighting in Stopochki and towards the southern outskirts of Chasiv Yar. So that's important to look at because it will then be relevant to the ongoing battle within the city itself. And speaking of the battle in Chasiv Yar, we have here this geolocation showing that there was a Russian advance, a really deep advance into the center of the city. So let's look at where it was actually filmed. It was from the 210th Assault Regiment in Berlingo. So they filmed a Russian squad. I think it was 2 or 3 Russian soldiers entering into a basement. And that indicates to us that the path that they passed through is no longer an area where Ukrainian soldiers are located. That, again, could indicate that Ukrainian forces were not able to drag out the fighting here following Russian gains that really solidified themselves in the eastern portion of the Okhtyabrsky district. Perhaps there just wasn't the same tenacity and fatigue built up in the western section, and that allowed DRG forces to initially cross through and make it all the way to the city center. And now there will be some sort of attempted Ukrainian correction, I'm sure, because you don't want to have Russian soldiers situated right in the middle in the areas that are the most prized in the city, including the factories, the city hospital, just stadium, massive structures that would be necessary in order to drag out fighting over here. And so definitely the route leading into it has been taken over by the Russians to a certain degree, with the rest of it being a gray zone. So now it's going to be the job of the 98th VDV division to clear out those remaining houses and ensure that they're under solid Russian control. And that would include also taking over this district to the south, just south of the Okhtyabrsky district, ensuring there's no more Ukrainian pressure coming in from this area, and as well with the area to the north, this area to the north that is protruding, not necessarily a settled area, but it is in a forested region that really Russian DRGs thrive in. Same goes for this area south of Chasiv Yar, south of the populated areas. Great staging zone for DRGs to push through and put additional pressure onto Mykolaiivka and the connection, the suburbs that then actually connect towards Chasiv Yar. So there are a lot of possibilities here, but it is important to note that now the Russians have displayed the ability to break through the Ukrainian lines in an area that nominally should be very well defended, as it is the eastern entrance to a major city on the front line, and then actually penetrate into the center. Now, to briefly mention Siversk, I want to look at a really serious incident in the Russian military, because they have now ordered a shakeup of the 3rd Combined Arms Army. If you may recall, it used to be called the 2nd Army Corps because it used to be, of course, the LPR fighting force before it was integrated 2 years ago into the Russian military and given the new designation of 3rd CAA. And so they are in charge of much of the fighting on the Siversk front. They have the vast majority of the fighting force composed, and they are the ones that are actually leading the charge in a lot of the assaults. But of course, the gains, they have been relatively slow in comparison to other fronts. The Ukrainian garrison here, which is very tight-knit, consisting of 4 or 5 very strong brigades, has been able to provide a very solid, almost semicircular perimeter to Siversk and nearby villages, which has been chipped away at, especially to the south, but not necessarily to the east in the direct sort of lead up to Siversk. So Russian forces in this region, the local brigade and battalion commanders, they spread false information about the capture of several villages such as Byelohorivka, Hryhorivka, all the way up to Serebryanka, also Verkhno-Kamyanske, and they exaggerated advances that were occurring or were in the process of occurring, because we did look at geolocations of some Russian advances here, but a lot of them did not materialize, were repelled by the Ukrainian garrison, or were only in open fields near these villages and not necessarily taking them over directly. And so for a while you had, and this was last month, reports being fed to the higher ups, the Russians, the commanders that are not on the ground and don't have, this firsthand view, and they begin to believe that. And through that initial misinformation, it came to Russian Telegram channels and eventually spread into the mainstream war reporting. And that's how I started mentioning in the first place these Russian advances that were also discussed by the Ukrainian side. And to further back up the narrative, the Russian local garrison moved in war reporters to areas that are very close to the front line to appear to give the understanding that actually it was solidly under Russian control, and try to feed that to the population. Same thing with drones dropping flags onto certain locations to try to prove that the Russians are actually there. But eventually this facade really collapsed because one of the higher ups, he requested a visit of Byelohorivka, which he assumed would be safe because based on the local reporting, the Russians would have already been in Hryhorivka and Serebryanka. So he wanted to visit in Byelohorivka, and obviously that would not be possible because the town is right now contested, largely under Ukrainian control, and that's how eventually the entire scheme was exposed. So you had a massive shakeup in the command staff of the 3rd Combined Arms Army. A large amount of staff dismissed, some actually being arrested. You also had the commanders of the 7th Motorized Rifle Brigade and the 123rd Brigade, which is located somewhere over here. I want to show you guys the logo. Yeah, their commanders were arrested, and now you're going to have to see a massive shakeup in the unit compositions. And I would say this speaks to the sense of urgency that these units felt to really get things moving, to actually begin advancing after 2 years of generally not seeing significant advances. Looking at the Oskil River front, you can see large-scale Russian gains as a result of the Ukrainians pulling back from a very exposed salient. This amounts to 27 square kilometers of territory being captured. It wasn't hard fought over directly, but it all came as a part of an equation of the Russian forces both advancing from the north into this very deep Pischane flower, as they call it, as it bloomed all the way to the Oskil River itself. The capture of Berestove, which occurred several months ago and really was the canary in the coal mine for a lot of the future Russian gains. The capture of Stelmakhivka, which was hard fought over. So then all of that shaping that occurred around this pocket eventually squeezed out the Ukrainian forces, and now they're trying to set up a more compact line in an area that is more fortified. So that will probably have to be around Lozova, which is an actual settlement that they can organize around. Also nearby, there are some scattered defenses. It's not a proper line. The proper lines are a bit to the south, and there are two layers that we know about for sure east of Borova. So now the Ukrainians are just trying to preserve the large scale gap that they have in between the current line of contact and that first structure defense line, because they really want to have a strong buffer zone to drag out the fighting before the Russians can even reach that area. Looking at Kupiansk to the north, we don't have any confirmed elaboration on where the Russians are located, although I will say that Ukrainian sources claim that the initial sort of breakthrough that occurred south of that dairy canning facility has been repelled to a large extent by the 116th Mechanized Brigade, and then also 14th and 30th Brigades involved. So they're not giving an exact update as to whether the Russians are located near this armory or near the rail line. Although Russian sources do claim that they do still have a strong presence along the rail line and that they've now sort of turned it into a permanent strong corridor through which mechanized assaults occur on a daily basis, dismounting forces. So their front line will look something more like this for a Russian source, wherein they would acknowledge larger portions of the city really along that red line are under Russian control, but some Russian sources do not claim that the armory is under their possession, that it's currently in a gray zone. And again, you have very heavy fighting going on around the local fodder plant. You have metal plant. You have the sugar plant. So there's just a large amalgamation of industrial centers that are being fought over. You can see them marked here on the map. And really that's going to determine whether the Russians can get a strong foothold and then bypass the fighting within residential areas and just seize directly the industrial zone and use that as the launching point for attacks deeper and deeper into eastern Kupiansk. Now, to look at the border between Kharkiv and Belgorod, Ukrainian sources, including deep state reports on DRGs, Russian DRGs, successfully crossing over the border and capturing once again the village of Sotnitsky Kozachok. So I'm marking it as a gray zone right now because it is still acknowledged as DRG activity, so I can't really be sure about whether they stayed there and then pulled out. But definitely the Ukrainians are not over here, and this village has been going back and forth for several months now, so it is important to keep it out because Russian forces really have been operating strongly around it and make really regular attacks into it and have displayed their ability to stay there for an extended period of time for several intervals. So definitely keep an eye out for that region. In addition, you do have the Ukrainians now passing legislation that will give additional financial rewards to Ukrainian soldiers that are fighting within Russian territory, namely the Kursk operation, the Kursk offensive right now turned into, of course, a defensive operation to retain control over territory already captured. So the Kiev Independent reported that Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Kursk, they will receive additional monthly payments of 100,000 hryvnias, which amounts to 2,400 USD, and that's proportional to the amount of time they spend within Kursk itself. There's also a lump sum payment of 70,000 hryvnia, which is $1,700 for every 30 days that they spend within Russian territory for combats. And these benefits also apply to the Ukrainian police force, emergency services, and special operations departments. Their men may also be across the border and involved in these operations. Additionally, the Ukrainian government, they announced payments of 100,000 hryvnia to soldiers that are wounded on duty within Russia. So again, $2,400. And also, if a soldier were to die there, their family will receive 15 million hryvnias. That's what's being promised. It amounts to 363,000 USD. And really, these appear to be larger benefits in relation to what soldiers would be given if they were fighting in Donbass. It really does indicate how much Ukraine is valuing the continued presence and how much they want to hold on to the territory over here. It really does indicate their strong priorities. And when it comes to more generally the Ukrainian unit structure, the 155th Mechanized Brigade has finished its training in France. It has been training there for the past 2 months. It was formed, I believe, like late last year. And now it's completely formed. All the units are in place. It has received its training, and it will begin to get integrated into heavy combat fighting, and it's really, really needed. So at the very least, its 2nd and 3rd Mechanized battalions will be introduced into the fighting very soon. It has trained in France. It has received Caesars, so they have a lot of artillery training. Of course, also small arms fire training. They received Leopard 2A4s, which underwent training for in Poland for its tank battalion that this unit has. And it was also provided with general French logistics equipment and the VAB APC. So we now know they will be integrated into combat zones very soon. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.